My rich and successful brother hired someone to investigate me, hoping to prove I was a failure. Instead, they found out I had quietly built a business worth millions of dollars. In the heart of a close knit village, where whispers travel faster than wind, I grew up as the middle child of three siblings. It's funny how small communities can be both your warmest blanket and your tightest restraint. Every achievement and every failure becomes public knowledge, carefully preserved in the collective memory of neighbors who've known you since your first steps. My father is a monument to silent perseverance, a man whose calloused hands speak louder than his words ever could. As retirement looms on his horizon, the weight of years spent building others' dreams shows in the slight stoop of his shoulders. Besides him stands my mother, a beacon of traditional values who transforms our house into a home with an unwavering dedication to the principles her ancestors passed down through generations. Their roots run deep in religious soil, their beliefs as solid as ancient oak trees. The love I hold for them is unconditional, yet there's always been this invisible wall between us, built brick by brick with unmet expectations and disappointed sighs. But then there's my older brother, the family's crown jewel at 40, who seems to have walked straight out of our parents' dreams. He married the perfect woman, quiet, compliant, traditional, and fathered two boys who embody everything I never was: athletic, robust, and unapologetically masculine. Life has a cruel sense of humor. My brother, the successful car salesman, appointed himself as my unwanted life coach. His guidance comes wrapped in thinly veiled superiority, each piece of advice weighted with the implication that I'm somehow broken, needing to be fixed. His mentorship feels less like brotherhood and more like a project he's determined to complete, whether I want it or not. Behind his carefully curated facade of domestic bliss, the powerboat gleaming in his driveway, the ATVs parked proudly in his garage, and his picture-perfect family, lies something that feels hollow. His success story, told through materialistic achievements and his trophy wife, serves as a constant reminder of everything I'm supposedly lacking. Each boast about his oversized house and luxury cars drives the wedge of loneliness deeper into my heart. Looking back at my school days, I was that kid, the one who wore their heart on their sleeve, who could find tears faster than solutions. Asthma was my constant companion, though my parents dismissed it as merely an inconvenience. Depression, my silent shadow, has been walking beside me for as long as my memories stretch back, though it too went unacknowledged in our household. Athletics were never my forte. I couldn't throw a football in a straight line if my life depended on it. The shadow of my brother's academic and social prowess loomed large, with my parents never missing an opportunity to highlight the contrast between us. By the time I graduated high school with a mediocre 2.5 GPA, it felt like my fate as the family disappointment was sealed in stone. College became my escape route, funded by carefully hoarded savings, but fate had other plans. My departure during sophomore year sent shockwaves through our family's carefully maintained facade of perfection. Meanwhile, our youngest sibling, my sister, reigned as the family's crowned princess, though my memories of her are frozen in teenage snapshots preserved from the time before I left. Time has painted her portrait in complex strokes. She isn't the villain in this story, merely a product of endless indulgence. Perhaps it's easier for her to join the chorus of my critics than to risk becoming their next target. Her life followed our family's preferred script perfectly: a fairy tale wedding at 19, 3 children in quick succession, and a life that fits neatly into our parents' traditional puzzle. Among her children, I find myself drawn to her middle child, seeing echoes of my own story in this young soul who bears the familiar weight of being sandwiched between siblings. The irony doesn't escape me: how this child mirrors my own middle child struggles, facing the same mockery and dismissal that colored my younger years. It's like watching my own history repeat itself through a different lens, creating an unexpected bridge of understanding across our generational gap. Post-college became my Renaissance period. Instead of fighting my intrinsic nature, I embraced my inner nerd with open arms. The local comic book and video game store became my sanctuary for several years, though it's now just a ghost in the town's memory, having closed its doors 7 years ago. Yet in my family's eyes, I'm forever the guy behind that counter, frozen in time like a character in one of the comics I used to sell. But that store? It was Destiny's waiting room. There, I met a kindred spirit, another dreamer with a head full of code and a heart full of ambition. Together, we built an IT support company from the ground up, turning our shared passion into a thriving business. When a larger corporation came knocking with an acquisition offer, my partner saw our exit strategy. The buyout left me with substantial cash and stock options, a plot twist my family never saw coming. This success became a springboard for more ventures. I diversified into various side projects and investments, many of which blossomed beyond my wildest expectations. Though I rarely mention it, my net worth has crossed the seven-figure mark. Now, I serve as CTO at an exciting private startup, channeling my expertise into building something new. Yet wealth hasn't changed my fundamental nature. My life remains deliberately understated. A modest two-bedroom house furnished with secondhand pieces and a faithful 15-year-old Saturn that keeps me grounded. Romance takes a backseat to self-improvement as I juggle a demanding career with regular therapy sessions. The demons I wrestle, depression, asthma, and alcohol dependency, remain invisible to my parents who dismiss these struggles as mere figments of an overactive imagination. Through all the valleys and peaks, I've carved out my own definition of success. Yet family obligations persist, like the standing Sunday dinner invitation from my parents. Despite living on the opposite end of the state, making each journey feel like a pilgrimage across an emotional desert, these dinners remain an unspoken requirement, a thread connecting me to my roots, whether I want it or not. The journey home devours precious weekend hours, a mechanical pilgrimage of up to 2 hours each way, transforming Sundays into an exercise in family obligation. In their eyes, my unmarried status and what my brother dismissively labels as my mental case condition means my time holds less value. These family dinners evolve into 3-hour sermons on the art of proper adulthood, complete with unsolicited marriage counseling and family planning advice. The dining table becomes a stage for my brother's car-selling prowess, each sale celebrated like a Nobel Prize achievement. The unspoken accusation of being a mooch hangs heavy in the air if I dare miss a single dinner. In therapy sessions, I find myself repeatedly questioning this self-imposed ritual of weekly torment, searching for answers in the maze of family dynamics. Back home, my achievements evaporate like morning dew under the harsh sun of family skepticism. The town's collective memory stubbornly clings to an outdated image, the quiet kid who worked at the now-defunct game store. Meanwhile, my brother's persona looms large, the charismatic car salesman, the mature one, the success story. My retail background becomes ammunition for subtle mockery, each jab reinforcing the narrative they've written for me. A peculiar disconnect exists between my reality and their perception. How do you explain to people who dismiss video games as childish entertainment that you've built a career in cutting-edge technology? My attempts to share my professional world are like trying to describe colors to the colorblind, met with polite dismissal or, worse, my brother's patronizing interruptions. In these moments, silence becomes my shield. When my brother holds court with his technical pseudo-expertise, I retreat into quiet observation, watching him weave tapestries of misinformation. The prospect of correction feels like opening Pandora's box, unleashing a torrent of explanations and justifications I'm not ready to handle. Deep down, a paradoxical fear takes root. What if my success somehow diminishes me in their eyes? I've never claimed perfection. My life has had its share of storms and shipwrecks. But last month brought an unexpected plot twist. My brother, playing amateur detective, crossed a line by hiring a private investigator to probe into my life, masquerading it as a simple employment background check. I suspect he was orchestrating some kind of intervention, perhaps hoping to unveil the mess he believed I'd become. The investigation backfired spectacularly. Instead of finding evidence of failure, they uncovered the truth: my substantial net worth, my comfortable living situation, and various other private details I'd kept close to my chest. The irony of this amateur sleuthing affecting someone in the security sector wasn't lost on me. Thanks to unauthorized credit report inquiries triggering my alerts, I could trace the digital breadcrumbs right back to their source. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer to glass, shattering everything I thought I knew about my family's perception of me. Their sudden shift in behavior felt like watching actors switch roles mid-performance, jarring and unnervingly artificial. Years of being the family's afterthought had conditioned me to expect shadows. Now their spotlight of attention felt blinding and wrong. fury over the invasion of my privacy drove me to a decision that would forever alter our family's dynamic. I hired the same private investigation firm to dig into my brother's finances. What emerged from those pages was a portrait of a man desperately maintaining a facade of success while drowning in debt. 3 mortgages threatened to pull his house of cards down around him, while the IRS circled like vultures over his mounting back payments. The discoveries went beyond mere financial troubles. DWI arrests, domestic disturbance calls, and an open file with Child Protective Services painted a picture of a life spinning out of control. My golden boy brother, it seemed, had feet of clay. Our parents, by contrast, lived modest lives that matched their bank statements. Their financial prudence almost seemed quaint compared to my brother's excesses. I was so consumed with planning my confrontation at the upcoming family dinner that I completely overlooked investigating my sister, an oversight that would later prove significant. The dinner itself unfolded like a surreal theater production. My parents, perhaps shaken by their earlier discoveries about my success, treated me with an almost religious reverence that made my skin crawl. The change in the family hierarchy was palpable, and my brother's facade began to crack under the pressure. Halfway through the meal, his carefully maintained composure shattered, and he launched into a desperate monologue about recent commissions and an alleged promotion. I played my hand with surgical precision, offering congratulations while systematically exposing his financial house of cards. Each revelation landed like a perfectly timed punch. The IRS troubles, the crushing debt, the maxed out credit lines. The satisfaction I felt was hollow, tainted by the knowledge that I was dismantling not just his lies, but our entire family's carefully constructed reality. When I presented him with the investigation report, his initial denials withered under the ironic truth that his own actions had led me to the investigation firm. Our parents' reactions oscillated between theatrical shock and stern reproaches, though their performance felt as artificial as their newfound admiration for me. The most disturbing aspect was the realization that they'd needed my social security number to initiate their investigation, a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial revelation. The next hour devolved into a typhoon of accusations, decades of buried resentments erupting to the surface. The veneer of family unity cracked and peeled away, revealing the rot of greed and cowardice beneath. As I watched them turn on each other, my contempt grew with each passing minute. This wasn't the vindication I'd imagined. It was the autopsy of a family's dysfunction, performed over cooling dishes of a dinner no one would finish. In the aftermath, I found myself grappling with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes winning feels remarkably like losing. The satisfaction of exposing their duplicity was overshadowed by the realization that our family would never be the same. The question that haunted me wasn't about their betrayal anymore, but whether some truths are better left buried beneath the comfortable weight of familiar lies. I retreated into silence, watching the chaos unfold with a detached fascination. When provoked, I'd respond with nothing more than a shrug or a single word, each minimal response seeming to fuel their growing fury. Around the table, the collateral damage of our family's implosion was written on every face. My sister's husband shifting uncomfortably in his chair, my brother's wife staring at her plate, and their 5 children witnessing the dismantling of their family's carefully maintained facade. These dinners had always followed an almost liturgical routine. My sister's dutiful updates about her life, my brother and his wife's carefully choreographed boasting, my mother's attempted peacekeeping through mundane conversation, and my father's predictable complaints serving as a bitter dessert. But tonight, that familiar script lay in tatters around us, replaced by something raw and unprecedented. The usual subtle barbs about my masculinity and my failure to emulate my brother evaporated into a shocked silence. In their place, 3 decades of festering resentment erupted like a long, dormant volcano. My father, brother, and I circled each other like wounded animals, each of us armed with an arsenal of past grievances. Every childhood slight, every perceived betrayal, every moment of favoritism was excavated and examined under the harsh dining room lights. It was like watching a lifetime of carefully buried trauma perform its own autopsy. What should have felt like vindication instead filled me with a creeping nausea. The weight of my tactical error pressed down on me like a physical thing. Yes, my brother's deceit needed addressing, but did it require this nuclear option? I watched his children's faces crumple as their father's troubled history spilled across the dinner table like overturned wine, staining everything it touched. This wasn't the justice I'd imagined. It was vandalism of innocence. The breaking point came with my brother's explosion, his face contorted with a rage I'd never seen before. "You should have never been born." The words hung in the air like smoke, but what truly caught my attention was our parents' reaction. Their desperate attempts to calm him carried a franticness I'd never witnessed, as if they were trying to catch a falling glass before it shattered. He painted me as the family's original sin, the source of every dysfunction and failure. My parents made performative attempts at peacekeeping, but notably absent was any acknowledgement of their role in our family's toxic dynamic. Their intervention felt hollow, like actors going through motions they didn't believe in. Each moment brought a contradictory surge of validation and grief. Finally seeing the truth of our dysfunction laid bare, while mourning the family we pretended to be, the final twist came when they unveiled their ultimate weapon, an accusation that I had refused to help an ailing niece or nephew. The charge hung in the air like poison gas, but something about it rang false. No one had ever approached me about a sick child, no desperate phone calls, no urgent messages. The fabrication was transparent, born of desperation to shift blame, but I chose silence over challenge. Sometimes the most damning response is no response at all. The evening had become a masterclass in family dysfunction, each person playing their part to perfection. The scapegoat, the golden child fallen from grace, the enabling parents, and the silent witnesses. The chandelier light caught the tears in my sister-in-law's eyes as she hugged her children close, their dinner growing cold on china plates that had seen countless family meals, but never one quite like this. Their persistent belief that I still worked at the comic book store crystallized everything wrong with our relationship. The store closed in 2011. I reminded them for what felt like the 100th time, my words falling into the familiar void of their selective memory. The way they rewrote our family history to suit their narrative was both fascinating and horrifying, like watching someone repaint a family portrait while insisting the original colors never existed. The drive home felt endless, each mile weighted with the evening's revelations. Now I find myself trapped in an emotional maze of my own making. The knowledge of their newfound awareness of my financial success hangs over me like a storm cloud, promising the same rain of expectations and demands that once drenched my brother. Yet beneath this dread lurks a complicated gratitude, an acknowledgement of the roof over my childhood head, the food on my plate, the basic necessities they provided. These facts exist alongside the hurt, neither canceling nor justifying the other. This shifting landscape of family dynamics demands navigation tools I don't yet possess. My therapist will earn their fee helping me chart these waters where gratitude crashes against resentment and newly erected boundaries stand like lighthouses on treacherous shores. The truth about my childhood position in the family hierarchy, forever second place to my brother, casts long shadows over any potential reconciliation. The memories rise unbidden, my brother's fists, his kicks, his words that cut deeper than any physical blow. But what haunts me most is my parents' studied indifference, their practiced blindness to his abuse. Their silence was its own form of violence. Their persistent dismissal of verbal abuse as just words reveals a willful ignorance that feels almost criminal in retrospect. When those meant to protect you instead shield your abuser, it creates a special kind of wound, one that bleeds trust instead of blood. Years of battling these demons has left me exhausted. They are my family by birth, but perhaps not by choice moving forward. I can wish them well from a distance, like watching a storm from the safety of shelter. This chapter of my life feels ready to close, making way for blank pages waiting to be filled with something better. But the future poses its own riddles. What happens when love finds me, when marriage and children enter the equation? The complexity of introducing a new family to the one I've distanced myself from feels like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. How do you bridge a gap you've intentionally created? How do you explain to your children why they don't know their grandparents? The irony isn't lost on me, Vemo. They only valued my presence when it served their ego or their wallet. Now that they've discovered my financial success, their renewed interest feels like vultures circling fresh prey. Their behavior at dinner confirmed what I've long suspected. Their love came with conditions, price tags, and fine print. Looking at myself in the mirror tonight, I see someone different from the person they tried to make me become. I've built something real, something solid, despite their efforts to convince me of my inadequacy. Their narrative about who I am crumbled in the face of who I've actually become. Perhaps the greatest act of self-love is accepting that family isn't always forever, and sometimes the healthiest roots are the ones you plant yourself. The phone sits silent on my nightstand, a portal to a past I'm increasingly ready to leave behind. Tomorrow stretches ahead, undefined but full of possibility, a blank canvas waiting for the first stroke of a new picture, one painted entirely in my own colors. The challenge of introducing Ava to what I'd come to think of as my family's three-ring circus loomed over us like a storm cloud. Over countless pizza nights, the cheese growing cold as we strategized, we crafted our approach. Ava, with the kind of wisdom that made me fall for her in the first place, suggested a series of short, controlled encounters, like dipping our toes in treacherous waters before deciding to swim. The early coffee meetings felt like carefully choreographed diplomatic summits. My parents moved around us with an almost comical caution, as if any sudden movement might send me fleeing. My brother, usually so quick with words, seemed to choke on unspoken sentences, his usual bravado deflated by our new dynamic. But in this awkward dance, we found unexpected grace notes. My sister's genuine warmth, her children's unfiltered enthusiasm, especially her middle child who, with my features mapped across their face, took to Ava instantly. These brief encounters became our lifeline to family connection, quick forays into familiar territory with a clear escape route. It was like learning to breathe underwater. Each visit lasted a little longer, went a little deeper. The strategy worked better than I'd dared hope. Slowly, like ice thawing in spring, my family began to adapt to these new boundaries. Perhaps they realized this constrained access was better than no access at all. The walls I'd built weren't to keep them out entirely, but to protect the peace I'd fought so hard to find. Walking by the lake one summer evening, Ava and I talked about moving in together. The water reflected the sunset in broken fragments, much like how I now saw my family, pieces of a whole, beautiful in their own way, but never quite forming a perfect picture. The contrast between who I was then and who I'd become struck me with the force of revelation. From feeling like a family castaway to standing firmly on my own shore, I'd traversed an ocean of self-discovery. Together with Ava, I began imagining a different kind of family foundation, one built on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than the quicksand of obligation and guilt I'd known growing up. We knew there would be challenges. Family dynamics don't transform overnight. But for the first time, I felt equipped to handle them. The infamous Sunday dinners continued, but now on my terms. Sometimes I attended, sometimes I didn't, and the world kept spinning either way. Ava's presence at these gatherings became both my anchor and my compass, helping me navigate the still choppy waters of family relationships. Progress didn't mean perfection. There were still undercurrents of tension, old habits that died hard. The key was maintaining equilibrium, staying connected without getting pulled under. The foundation of my marriage crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide when Daisy embraced her bisexuality and proposed opening our marriage. The request itself wasn't what broke us. It was the discovery that followed. She had already acted on her desires with my coworker, someone I trusted as a close friend. The betrayal cut doubly deep, poisoning both my home life and my career as a police officer. The precinct halls now felt as hostile as my empty house. Initially, Daisy fought to preserve what remained of our marriage, her pleas becoming increasingly desperate as I remained firm in my stance against an open relationship. But when she realized my position wouldn't shift, something in her changed. The woman I'd known transformed into someone else entirely, bitter, manipulative, wielding our children like weapons in a war I never wanted to fight. The most crushing blow came through our daughter Peach's tearful questions. Daisy had been planting toxic seeds, telling our children I'd abandoned them because I no longer loved our family. Each time I had to look into their confused, hurt eyes and counter these poisonous narratives, a piece of me died inside. They now split their time between our home and their grandmother's house, where Daisy had taken refuge. At their grandmother's, Daisy and her new partner, AP, orchestrated what I call the Disneyland effect, drowning our children in toys, sweets, and excessive indulgence. It's a transparent attempt to buy their affection, to cast themselves as the fun parents while painting me as the villain in their story. Every weekend becomes a carnival of emotional manipulation, leaving me to deal with the sugar crash, both literal and metaphorical. The battlefield extends beyond emotional territory. Every negotiation about possessions, finances, and support payments becomes a new front in this endless war. But nothing compares to the agony of negotiating our children's time. Daisy fights every suggested arrangement as if compromise itself is admission of defeat. Her resistance feels less about the children's well-being and more about winning some invisible contest. The psychological warfare has escalated lately, with Daisy feeding our children carefully crafted narratives about my supposed hatred for AP, who, according to the stories she spins, loves them more than I ever could. These poisoned words seep into their young minds, creating doubts that no amount of reassurance seems to fully dispel. The breaking point came during my push for promotion to homicide investigator. The long hours and intense focus required a temporary adjustment to our custody arrangement. Daisy would have the kids during the week, with me taking weekend duty. It seemed reasonable until the moment I arrived to pick up Mario and found him clutching his oversized suitcase, tears streaming down his face as he repeated his mother's cruel fiction that I was abandoning them because I hated them. Holding him close, feeling his small body shake with sobs, I fought back my own tears while promising him my endless love. But even as the words left my mouth, I tasted their bitterness, not because they weren't true, but because I knew I'd be fighting against Daisy's narrative for years to come. Each embrace now feels like a desperate attempt to anchor my children against the storm of adult emotions threatening to sweep them away. The weekend visit felt like trying to embrace shadows. My children were physically present but emotionally distant, their silence speaking volumes. It wasn't until today's pickup that I finally had a chance to really see them, really hold them. As I lifted them into my arms, the weight of their sadness felt heavier than their physical presence. Peach's struggle tears at my heart in ways I never thought possible. Her love for me still shines through, but it's like watching a light trying to pierce through increasingly darker clouds of confusion, clouds that Daisy deliberately creates. Every day brings new challenges in minimizing the damage to our children's psyches. The twisted architecture of family dynamics that Daisy is building threatens to collapse on our children's emotional well-being. The most gutting moment came when Peach, my beautiful princess, began questioning her capacity to love me. The psychological manipulation has reached a point where she's struggling with her own emotions, trying to reconcile her natural love for her father with the poisonous narrative being fed to her. Watching her wrestle with this internal conflict has become unbearable. These circumstances force me to confront uncomfortable questions. Is pursuing this divorce actually protecting my children? Can I navigate this legal separation while shielding them from the emotional shrapnel? Or would staying, despite everything, somehow minimize their trauma? The advice I've received is unequivocal. This is textbook parental alienation, a form of psychological abuse that courts take seriously. Time is of the essence. Every day that passes allows these harmful patterns to become more deeply entrenched in my children's psyches. The path forward requires immediate and decisive action.